Check one, sibilance. Hey, this is Stomp. Just real briefly, Ty Gagne, thank you so much for coming in and chatting with Mike and I about your books, Where You'll Find Me, The Last Traverse, and your shorter essays, Emotional Rescue, and Weakness in Numbers. It was a great 4-hour deep dive. Just awesome. Ty was gracious enough to bring several signed copies of these books, as well as specialized note cards with a message on them. And he also wants to donate a virtual book chat to a lucky listener as well. So please listen to the end of this episode, because the details are all in there about how these raffles are going to work. The main purpose here is to donate money to the New Hampshire Outdoor Council. This is the nonprofit in New Hampshire that really supports volunteer search and rescue teams statewide. So again, take a listen and let's donate to the Outdoor Council. Alrighty, enjoy the episode.
Broadcasting from the Woodpecker Studio in the Live Free or Die state of New Hampshire. Welcome to the Sounds Like a Search and Rescue podcast, where we discuss all things related to hiking and search and rescue in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, occasionally including the counties of Belknap, something like that, and Coos, or is it Coos County? Whatever. Here are your hosts, Mike and Stomp.
The barbarians are storming the gate. Daphne's outside the door, literally headbanging the door, trying to get in here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, did I read? I thought I read on the script that Ty's allergic.
Yeah. So this will be fun to watch me deteriorate over 2 hours, and for your audience.
Very nice. Yeah.
I'm rolling too.
It's all gonna be fun.
All right. Stomp, do you want to tilt your camera up a little bit so I can see Ty? I can see, sort of like when my grandmother used to take photos, you'd cut the top of the heads off, but there we go. All right, Stomp. So I guess for the show opener here, I'm just looking at the notes. So we're starting with the creepy promotional photo that you sent over. The reason why we don't do video is because not only do I not look good, but you look extra not good. So I don't know what you were doing with that weird black and white photo.
He's talking to me, right?
It was, I think I was inspired by that Beatles documentary on Netflix. Have you seen that?
Not yet.
Get Back?
No.
It's Peter Jackson's amazing.
Yeah.
He really is. So I was trying to do a With the Beatles ripoff. If you're familiar with that album, it's a black and white silhouette album. I'm like, okay, let's give it a shot for a little promo.
I sent that to all my kids and my wife, and they were just like, you both look super creepy. And I was just like, oh, I never want to see my face on a promo video again, or picture.
Have you seen The Alpinist?
I have not.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I've seen the preview for it.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. You got to watch it.
Okay. Yeah, he's a free soloist, right?
He was. Yeah.
He was?
Yeah, he died.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
But he wasn't solo when he perished.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah. Well, that's next on the list.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I just watched that like 2 nights ago, but unfortunately, it's really good, and I shouldn't have fallen asleep, but I was just exhausted because it was just a crazy day. But I woke up like right at the end of it, and so I missed a little bit of it, but I want to go back and watch it.
It's tough. It's a tough watch.
It's sort of like, I always think, when Alex Honnold had that other movie out, I just kept thinking like that's going to happen to him eventually. But I think maybe with his life changes and meeting his girlfriend, his tolerance for risk has gone down a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, so far.
Or gone. Yeah.
Who knows what he has planned, but...
Yeah, exactly. But Stomp, the other thing I wanted to ask you with the show opener so that I don't forget is you had, and I've gotten this question from a couple of people, as a matter of fact, because I think there's like a shortage of Christmas trees in the area where I live, but you went and got a permit and was able to cut down a Christmas tree up in New Hampshire. Is that right?
It was great. Yeah, $5. And my wife and I went out. It took us a couple days. We went to a few locations, and there was just nothing. So I ended up going on Google Earth and found some really nice spots to check out. And they have some regulations. You're supposed to be about 100 feet off the road or trailhead, and at chest height, which would vary for individuals, it has to be 6-inch diameter, which is interesting. So I noticed as on my commute to Grafton County nursing home there that Lost River had a ton of trees. So it was a beautiful spot. So I went hiking in and worked out great. It's a nice option. I mean, the reason I looked into it was because of this backup in the delivery system here, So some places like local farms weren't receiving trees and whatnot. So, it's a nice resource for us. Have you ever done that, Ty?
Oh yeah. As a kid, my family and our extended family would go out into the woods, and I'm not convinced it was legal, but is this being recorded right now?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, we're not. We'll delete this part.
It was, but that was a long time ago.
That's funny. So yeah. Oh, you saw the tree up there. It's like 15-foot tree.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So the from our second floor bedroom, you can see the star, and that was a S show for sure, because I was on the top of a 6-foot ladder with a 6-foot broom trying to get this topper on top. I should have put it on before I elevated the thing, but lesson learned.
Yeah. Does Mrs. Stomp do the thing that my wife does where like you'll put, I think we switched to an angel at this point, but we had to start, but like you'll get it up there and then you'll come down from the ladder, and then she immediately is like, well, it's a little bit crooked. You need to fix it.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. That's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I'll have, I will put the link on the rules from I think you had sent it to me, Stomp, about like the rules from the Forest Service around how to get the permit and what the rules are as far as what you can cut down. Cause I think that's a pretty cool thing to do with at least one time. Like I have a fake tree now cause I just don't deal with the real trees anymore, but it's worth it to do it. And do you need to be a New Hampshire resident, or can you be a masshole to do it?
It did not ask that during the purchase process online, so I think you can just sign in and get your permit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. All right. So next up, before we get to our show opener, is cat news. Everybody wants to know what the Daphne situation is.
Well, in terms of what? Like,
is Daphne in the room?
No, she's blocked out of respect for our guest.
I feel bad.
No, it's okay. It's like, but no, seriously, she's headbutting the door. So I think she's calmed down a bit, but we'll let her in towards the end, and hopefully Ty will take a little selfie with her. We're going to start a wall of selfies with Daphne. Yeah, she's a sweetie, but she's 1 year old, so she's just high energy. Well,
good luck, Ty. Hopefully you'll survive down there. That Stomp is basically a crazy cat lady, so you're in for a long afternoon. So Stomp, listener questions you have here that we get a couple of questions.
Yeah, a couple here. First of all, this one's for you, Mike. What's your take on the hiking buddies? I figured you could answer that one quick.
So we had the hiking buddies on, and matter of fact, this will be a good topic to bring up with Ty as well while he's here. But I think that people are going to get together regardless. I think that they serve a good purpose. We had Ben on, so you can definitely listen to, I forget the episode number, but I'll link it. The people that I hear that are not a fan of the group or these type of groups say that, there's no controls, that people are splitting up, and that it's not a safe way to meet people. My view is that there's going to be an increase in demand in hiking for the foreseeable future with social media. And I think overall, there hasn't been any issues with the hiking buddy groups. And I think overall, I'd rather have a resource for people to be able to connect and communicate about their interest. And I think that we can cover a little bit of this with Ty, and we'll talk about this later on in the show. But I think the theme that you want to focus on when you're doing any sort of meetup groups is to go into it with the intent that you're going to be very clear about what your physical capabilities are, what your interests are, and the fact that you plan to stick with the group the entire time.
Well said. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, as listeners will see, the group dynamic is an interesting topic, and we'll dive deep into this. Any comments on that, or were you distracted with the mic stand?
No, I have plenty to talk about with my own experience with two other hikers who I didn't know. So
yeah, let's save it for that segment because we do a deep dive on that essay of yours.
Yep.
Can someone teach Mike that an SUV is not an ATV?
Yeah, I don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, I know the difference.
Okay, there you have it. It's short and sweet. I'm not sure what that means either.
Yeah,
it's got to be some reference that must have happened. And then this one's, I guess, for anybody, but this person writes, I would love to hear your thoughts on Leave No Trace philosophy, more specifically bushwhacking. I feel as though I've been trained to stay on trail since I was a kid, but I'm also intrigued by the idea of bushwhacking. I've had plenty of times that I've bushwhacked my way as a result of being lost behind my house. Not good, but never have set out to do this. Thank you. My thought on it, I put a lot of thought into this actually because it's a really interesting topic. I think you can make the argument that there's more trail damage being done by the volume of people on the trails. Like, for instance, up on Falling Waters, the switchbacks are almost non-existent now because people are just beelining straight up to save time or distance or whatever. And I would say that if you're an experienced bushwhacker, first of all, the percentage of people bushwhacking is minute compared to the people that are on the trails, in my opinion. So the people that are really out there bushwhacking are generally pretty educated about just care, foot placement, and things like that. And you're following herd paths a lot of the time, which are basically trails that the animals are using. So you're really not doing anything out of the ordinary or against those Leave No Trace ethics or rules, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that, and I've seen that on social media before, where people will utilize Leave No Trace as a explanation for not doing bushwhacking. But I think the rules of Leave No Trace say something about making sure that you're traveling on firm ground or something. I don't know the details. We'll have to get a Leave No Trace expert on here, but ultimately, you're right. Like these, avoiding mud puddles on existing trails probably has a lot more damage than somebody that's doing the 500 highest and going off and bushwhacking. So I think that it's a gray area. I do think that if you are bushwhacking, like, you do want to stay on firm ground and not go through, fragile vegetation and things like that. But I don't do enough bushwhacking to know how prevalent that is.
But I mean, even the chances of you coming over the same terrain twice is infinitely impossible. When you're bushwhacking, you're not doing the same route twice. So I just think that the risk of damage is pretty minimal, if any at all.
Yeah, agreed. Lots of questions.
Let's dive into some White Mountains history, shall we?
I did a little bit of research. So last week we talked about Darby Field, who had ascended Mount Washington, I think in like 1640 or something like that, 1648. And the fact that there wasn't a lot of activity that was documented between that period and when the Crawfords settled Crawford Notch in like the early 1800s. So I did do a little bit of research, and I've got a bunch of books here that I was flipping through, and I think the one sort of expedition that stands out to me was sometime in like the later 1700s. Jeremiah Belknap, I always pronounce that wrong, and Reverend Manasseh Cutler. So this is the guy I'm assuming is named after the Cutler River drainage. They did do an expedition up to Mount Washington and the presidentials in the late 1700s. So was a little bit more activity going on, and I think this is a pretty well documented expedition. So I'll do a little bit more research on it, and at some point there's a couple of historians that we want to reach out to get some more of a deeper dive into these early expeditions up to the presidential. So we'll work on that.
We have a couple donations here, just to move along. Okay. We have her new name is H-less Sarah without an H, so it's H-less Sarah, donated 3 coffees. Okay. Chris donated 5, and Fisomo donated a coffee. Thank you very much.
A special thank you to our sponsor, Reckless Brewing, where you'll enjoy the best food, craft beer, and fun just 15 minutes from Franconia Notch, many 4,000 footers, and less than 10 minutes from the Five Corners. Visit them online at recklessbrewing.com. REKLIS brewing.com.
Want to transition to the show summary here, Stomp?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, so tonight we are joined by writer Ty Gagne. He is the author of the books Where You'll Find Me, Risk Decisions, and The Last Climb of Kate Matrosova. And he also has written the book The Last Traverse, Tragedy and Resilience in the Winter Whites. In addition to his long-form writing, Ty has written some shorter-form essays, including Footprints in the Snow Leads to an Emotional Rescue, which tells the story of local SAR team member Pam Bales and is the basis of the upcoming film starring Naomi Watts called Infinite Storm. Ty will share some of his thoughts on New Hampshire Search and Rescue, general hiking safety, and we'll probably be peppering him with a bunch of questions about his writing. So we're very excited to have Ty joining us. I'm Mike.
And I'm Stomp. Let's get started.
All right. Very good. So before we get into talking with Ty, do we have any beer discussion here, Stomp? You drinking anything?
No, it's a Java day. It's 11:30 in the morning.
I got a nice coffee.
For God's sakes, if I was drinking beer, that'd be bad.
Yeah, Ty, usually we'll have a beer and we have a little segment where we talk about like what we're drinking, but...
Oh, did you make it to that coffee shop, Ty?
Yeah, Mad River Coffee House. And I was pretty psyched to stop there, get a coffee, and I'll be taking a few bags home. So,
I think that's great.
Yeah, support Mad River Coffee.
They're great. Right at, what is it, exit 28, right off the exit. Great coffee shop. How about you, Mike?
Yeah, I'll have to check them out.
You drinking some whiskey?
I just have like my wife gets the Starbucks iced coffee in the refrigerator, so I'll usually have like an afternoon coffee, but I'll be a little shaky and quivery, I think, later on today.
I know. I'm jacked up right now. It's like, no.
Exactly.
Too much.
All right. Any recent hike, Stomp, that you want to go over with us?
Yeah, sure. I love this area. Have you hiked over to the Newfound area, Ty?
No.
It's really neat because you have Tenny Mountain, which has all those windmills on top. So that's north to south. And then just behind that, you have Bald Peak and Mount Crosby, which is part of the Cockermouth Forest. And it's just a beautiful place. I mean, it's one of those places you can go to where there are no people, and you get these really stunning views. You can actually see from Mount Moosilauke all the way east to Chicora, and you can see Mount Washington on the horizon. It's an amazing spot. So that was my most recent adventure, and I did Tenny before it started snowing. That was fun too. So I'm just sort of revisiting some old haunts. How about you, Mike?
So Tenny is that's the mountain that has, like, if you're on the Moosilauke Highway and you go past the Polar Caves and you see those windmills, that's Mount Tenny?
Yeah. So you have to go, when you hit the rotary on Tenny Mountain Drive, you drive south maybe 5 miles. That's Tenny. It's a neat place. Those windmills are massive, by the way, when you get under those things. They're huge. Got to be at least 100 feet high. Incredible.
Yeah, no, I've never been over there. I'll check it out. But I did get out on Sunday. I drove up to the Ferncroft parking lot, which is the trailhead where you can typically everybody accesses Whiteface and Passaconaway from there. But I took the other direction and I did a 6-mile loop of Mount Hibbard. So I recently completed the 52 with a view, but I have a few of the delisted peaks that I need to hike out to. So Hibbard was on the list. So I went up Old Mast, I think is the name of the trail. And then from there, I think it's called the Warden Trail. And I climbed, I think that sub-peak is called Hedgehog, but it's not the Hedgehog that's on the 52 with a view. It's the Wannalasset version of Hedgehog Mountain, and then over to Hibbard, and then over Wanalancet. So it's a 6-mile loop, 6.5-mile loop, and it was beautiful. There's no views on the peaks of any of those mountains, but there's a few side trails where you get some really nice views out to the east. You can see Chicora, and then into that research forest below. Whiteface, you can look out to Sandwich Dome and Morgan and Percival. So it's really a great hike. I didn't see a single person, so it was Sunday.
Notice the theme here, Ty.
Yeah, exactly. That's the goal. Is that, the less people we see, the better. I saw my friend Dolores about a mile towards the end. So I was almost done, and she was coming up. And Dolores is the one that had told us, she had given the feedback previously that I had seemed distracted sometimes during the podcast.
Yep. Okay.
So I was laughing, but she was giving me some tips on yoga, because I was telling her that when I had to put on my microspikes to start climbing up, I almost threw my shoulder and my back out because I have no flexibility. So
it's pretty sad.
Yeah, it is.
You got to get out of that basement. That's what you got to do.
Yeah.
It's time for SLASR's Guest of the Week. Very cool. Very cool.
Let's transition into peppering Ty with a bunch of questions here. So Ty, just to give you some background, myself and Stomp, we've been talking about putting this podcast together for like 2-3 years, and we actually were just talking and never actually doing anything about it. And I had started a Facebook group to sort of discuss search and rescue incidents that came up. And to be honest with you, it was sort of started from the perspective of being very judgmental about search and rescue. And over time, it's transitioned into much more of we just want to get information out, and we want to be, not push judgment on people, but to educate. And I think watching your sort of impact on the hiking community with the books that you've written really has inspired myself and Stomp to realize that there is definitely an audience that is interested in this, and that it's valuable information. And the amount of search and rescue activity that we see year over year is pretty consistent still. So we haven't seen any sort of impact as far as the numbers dropping, but it's held steady pretty much. And I think there's been a growth in overall hiking activity. So my perspective is maybe we're making an impact with getting the message out. I know that your books have a much wider audience than we do, but you've inspired us to try to get some sort of a message out to people. So we're excited to have you join us. And, I guess from there we can, if you want to just transition into introducing yourself, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, thank you both for the invitation to be here, and congratulations on the podcast. I think it's great that you're focusing on education and raising awareness, particularly through this medium, which a lot of people are drawn to. My name's Ty. I was born in New Hampshire. I've never left. And I currently work in risk management, and I really have tried to blend that work that I do professionally with the things that I write about. And I'm psyched to get peppered by questions today.
Well, this is the most prep I've ever done for a show. I've been at it all week. But it's been fascinating.
You better not screw it up. But, so Ty, I guess start from the beginning. Can you talk a little bit about, were you a hiker growing up? Did your family expose you to it, or did you pick it up later on in life? Yeah.
So going back to your point about Percival, and I cut my teeth along with many people from this area on Rattlesnake Mountain near Squam Lake, and the Ridgepole Trail, and then all of those, the classic elementary school field trips, to Chicorowa, to Moosilauke. I still have trauma over the Moosilauke hike just because of the story of Dr. Benton they told the night before.
Oh, you got that story, huh? We talked about that during the Halloween episode.
Did you?
Yeah.
Long-lasting effect.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And then from there, I really, my elementary school industrial arts teacher took me rock climbing in between my 5th and 6th grade summer. Absolutely fell in love with it. And through his mentorship and wisdom, because he's just one of the nicest people, but really one of the best climbers I've ever been around, progressed into ice and alpine routes, and then and so that's kind of my story.
Great. And do you still get out and hike a lot now?
Not right now. I'm mostly talking about hiking and climbing with people. And that's okay, because I think those conversations, I think to your point about raising awareness, are important. And if that's where my focus is right now, I'm okay with that. But I will, I do miss high places for sure.
Okay. And then with a background in risk management, can you talk a little bit about, your career in risk management, and then how did you transition into writing the books?
Well, I was in public safety for a little over a decade, many, many years ago. So I was a first responder, and as you know, Stomp, first response is a lot of that is about the managing of risk. So I think that, my passion for local government and just having been kind of raised in that discipline transitioned nicely into the work I'm doing now, where we provide risk management consulting and claims work and HR consultation and that kind of thing for school, municipal, and county governments throughout New Hampshire. The writing goes way, way back. I think, I wrote a column for our local newspaper. My mother saved all of those newspaper clippings. Otherwise, I may have forgotten about those. But yeah, I think I was around 10 years old. I really enjoyed writing in elementary, middle school, and high school. And I think part of that was just because I was really shy. I didn't have a lot of self-confidence, and I would spend a lot of time in my own head. When you do that, I think that's where a lot of creativity comes from, is that, those times when we're in our own head and we're thinking about things. And so I think that's really kind of the early origins of the writing. And then, it was fits and starts. I never really put a lot of focus on it. I went to undergrad into grad school, and there's a ton of writing in both, and I was really drawn to that.
Great. And then as far as the connection with search and rescue, so you were involved in public safety and aware of that, but have you always been interested in search and rescue, or was that something that you picked up relatively recently? Yeah,
I didn't know it existed until I read Not Without Peril in my early 20s. And, Mike Pelchat, Rick Wilcox, all of the names that we sometimes see in publications and in news stories. And I took a really strong interest in that. At one point I went to a Mountain Rescue Service meeting, and they were in the process of purchasing portable radios for the team members. And I had some experience in that. And actually my climbing partner was on MRS at the time. And I can remember just standing in that room, just talking to them about digital technology and portable radios, and as they were pondering that. So it was probably my first contact with search and rescue, and had a tremendous amount of respect for MRS. Wasn't really familiar with the other teams, which at that point there really were not a lot of other teams in the state as there are now. So I've always been drawn to mountaineering literature, stories like that out of the wild, out of remote places, and that interest in search and rescues has always kind of stayed with me.
Got it. And then I talked a little bit about this in the opener, but like I used to, not to say it was amusing, but I always used to just sort of say, I'm interested in search and rescue, but that would never happen to me because of X, Y, and Z. But has your view as far as, people's behavior and looking at incidents changed over time? Or have you always been able, because I feel like you sort of take a very non-judgmental approach to it, and you talk about like what could be done to improve the safety approach in certain situations. But can you talk a little bit about, I guess, how your view of human behavior when it comes to search and rescue has evolved over time? Yeah,
I think it's been pretty consistent. Whenever I've read a newspaper article or seen a media report, or again, I'll go back to Not Without Peril probably multiple times throughout our conversation. I wasn't looking through a lens of judgment. I was really interested and fascinated with, well, how did that happen and what was it like to be in that situation? I think what's probably evolved over time is where I saw the opportunity to use that approach, hoping that maybe a reader would take something away from the way I presented the information that would help them, whether that person was a hiker or not. And I think that's been one of the most meaningful parts of all of this is the number of people I've come into contact with and have been able to talk with about these things, that whether a hiker or somebody that works at sea level or a high school student, or it covers all the bases, I think.
Got it. And then with the initial proposal for the book, did you have a sense that there was a market and a strong interest in this topic, or were you just looking at this as this is going to be a passion project for me, and if it sells, it sells, and if it doesn't, it's just something that I think is important to get out to the public?
Yeah, I think to go back to your previous question about judgment and then move on to the book, I have yet to meet anyone, and I put myself in this bucket, that has lived an error-free life. And if we think about, our school age years, we're learning about things that have happened as a result of trial and error, as a result of risk-taking decisions, and many times as a result of tragedy and failure, sadly. And over time, when we start to have our own experiences and we start to apply those lessons, I do think there's this point that we can come to where we think we possess total knowledge over a subject matter, and this would never, as you said, this would never happen to me, and we get judgy. And I think when that happens, we stop learning at a certain. We're not open to new information, and we're not open to exploring the whys and what I can take away, because maybe we've had perfection in the mountains, right? And we've never had anything go wrong. But if you broaden that lens, I'm sure there's something in our lives that we can look back at and say, through that series of decisions I made, this thing totally got away from me. But when we judge, I think part of that, I think, is self-preservation. And we're trying to distance ourselves from our own stuff. And it's easier to focus on what everyone else did wrong. As far as the book goes, I had no idea the response that would happen. It didn't start out as a book project. It was never my intention to write Where You'll Find Me. That started out as a presentation that I put together for work for public entities throughout New Hampshire, looking at accidents in the White Mountains as a metaphor as to, what can we take away from those that would help us on day to day at work or outside of work. And that's where it started. And when I did this presentation back in May of 2015, I thought I was only doing it once. I didn't think it would go anywhere. But I was invited by a member of the audience at that session to present to a group of school superintendents from throughout New Hampshire in the fall, and decided that I would just focus on the story of Cape Matrosova and the rescuers. So I worked through the summer, gathered more information, did the presentation in the fall, thought that was it, and was invited to speak to PEMI Search and Rescue at one of their monthly meetings. And from there, I think it just it snowballed.
Great. And what was the writing process like for you? Did you just do it all in like a quick burst, or did you need to do it over time and write like a couple of 100 words a day? How does that work?
Yeah, well, both the process for each book was different, and there were reasons why the second book had a different process that I'll talk about. With the first book, I had been out talking about this for a little over a year and a half, and at each presentation that I would do, I would get a question and I didn't have the answer to. And I would go out and I would try to get the answer to that question to be prepared for the next time I would do it. And over time, just more and more information and data accumulated. I did a presentation for the Fish and Game Command staff on the accident, gleaned more information from that. I did a presentation at Gunstock Ski Area for they're under the auspices of Belknap County. And every year they hire back their entire staff and they do a safety day. And I met the Black Hawk helicopter pilot from the Matrosova mission, who was also on ski patrol part-time at Gunstock, and was able to glean more information from him. So when I got ready to write the book, I had a lot of the information already, and a lot of it was already formatted in my head just from talking about it so much. And so I started writing. My publisher is also he initially did the illustrations for the presentation that I did before the book. And he has a very small publishing house, and I approached him. I'm ready to try to write this. Here's what I want to accomplish. And he signed on. There was no advance. There's no marketing arm. I went out on my own at my own expense and hired an editor and a proofreader. But really spent about 6 months writing that book, while still going out and doing some interviewing here and there to close loops. But I would get up at 4 in the morning or so. I'd write for 3 hours and get ready for work, commute to work, would come home at night, and I would get the materials that I planned to write about the next morning all set and ready to go, so that when I was back in the seat early morning, I was ready to write. And then on weekends, obviously, there was some longer efforts.
So you have to have a passion for this. You're doing this sort of outside of your normal work hours and getting up early and doing it. So, Stomp, it sounds like us. We have a passion for the podcast. So Ty's been very passionate about his writing piece here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you need to have a passion for these creative endeavors for sure. We talked to a few different guests about the creative process and refinement and editing and stuff like that. And it's similar across all these different genres, whether it be art or audio or writing. And it's really, you got to love it. You got to dive in. I've dabbled with audio production, and I'll put in hundreds of hours on one song, constantly refining. Yeah. I'm sure you do that too with text. It's a lot of work, but yeah, you got to love it.
And I do love it. I don't really know how to explain it, but just the research. Yeah. I love the research side of it. I love talking with subject matter experts, and then what I also just really like to do in as authentic a way as possible is how can I put the reader there, and I'm not saying I'm ever going to get to that point, but I really do put a lot of effort and focus on that part of it.
Yeah, I don't typically enjoy writing, but I enjoy the challenge of trying to do what you just said. And I had a question about that, actually. I was wondering if some of your descriptive moments are from maybe just common experience that you assume that people would experience, or from your life. Like, for instance, the bully wind up on Franconia Ridge. Or there was another one that was fantastic where, the Mylar whipping like a, drum. Does that come from you being a musician, or just like common observations? Or
the only musical instrument I can play is the recorder, which I learned in 4th grade. So I can't. I love music, though. Don't get me wrong. I love music.
Yeah.
I think those things come from life experiences, and I've been bullied on Franconia Ridge by the wind.
Sure.
I know what strong wind feels like, and you know what it sounds like as it moves through terrain and as it moves past you and your gear. So I think I try to draw from the past.
Yeah.
And the things I've been through.
Yeah, well done.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and Ty, picking projects, I'm assuming over time you've been approached, especially since your first book, and you've probably been approached about a number of different topics, and I'm assuming you've probably passed on doing a number of projects. Do you have like a criteria where you'll just say, this doesn't feel right to me, or are you able to sort of describe how you pick and choose your projects?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. As for where you'll find me, really, again, that evolved out of an educational program, and that story really resonated with me for many reasons. The prologue to the book, Full Conditions, originally started as an essay that I wrote for Appalachia called Weakness in Numbers, about an experience I had on Franconia Ridge, which ultimately led to the book, The Last Traverse. There's a tie-in there. I mean, I've been approached, and I've really appreciated that and been humbled by those things. I am selective about the stories, and in some ways I didn't know the people at the time. I mean, you do have somewhat of you have that it connects with you, it moves you, and that's the direction I get drawn in and drawn toward. And I'm also just really, really mindful of the fact that there are people that are directly impacted by these accidents, whether it's the victim or the family. And if the family or the victim is not open to talking about these things and having me write about them, I won't do it. I mean, I make that very clear to the people I sit down with, that if you're not comfortable with this, and comfortable might be the wrong word, but that I'll walk away. And I'll just share with you, I had one that I looked into, and the individual directly involved was not didn't want to go there, and I turned my back on it and said, okay, you will not see me writing about this outside of here. This is where it stops.
Got it. And I think it makes sense too, because ultimately you're trying to learn from these incidents and pass that knowledge on. And if somebody is not willing, or they're going to be traumatized by it, then it's probably best to leave it. Yeah,
that's just the principle I've followed through this whole path.
Got it. Well, I think you had mentioned your weakness in numbers. So I think we should probably transition into talking about that, Stomp. And I think you were going to take this segment to kind of dive into this point. And I could tee it up a little bit. Basically, there's this sense that I think when you talk to people about hiking that maybe aren't as familiar about hiking, like a lot of times I'll get questions because I do solo hiking, and I solo hike in the winter, and I solo hike, pretty big miles in the summertime quite a bit, and Stomp, you do as well. And I think most people on the surface would assume that the biggest risk situation you can put yourself in is as a solo hiker. But the reality is I think that we find that a lot of the search and rescue incidents that happen in the Whites are a result of, not a result, but they're in the involvement of group hikes. So we want to talk a little bit about, what some of those things are that we want to be aware of when we are in a group, because it's not as simple as people would assume that you've got 3 or 4 people, there's strength in numbers, and everyone's going to stay safe. So I'll Stomp if you want to transition into this segment.
And you're not going to hurt my feelings, so be direct.
And
I've hiked with Stomp a few times too, so yeah. We'll probably be able to share some of our stories.
Oh, sure. So I would encourage the listeners to read these essays on their own. I mean, there's no way that we could dive into this stuff to such great detail, but we like to ask guests if they've had any close calls up on the ridge, and this essay that you wrote, Weakness in Numbers, essentially is your close call, or maybe one of several, who knows, but I'll just briefly give people an idea what it is. It's Ty's explanation of how he met up with 2 hikers that were fairly skilled, and it was in February of 2008, and the plan was to go up over Franconia Ridge, and it just was sort of an off day, right, Ty? More or less? Just like the red flags. You talk about red flags a lot.
Yeah, and I can look back on this now, and I'm really transparent about it. I think the first 2 red flags for me was accepting the invitation to go with people I didn't know, and that my level of physical fitness for what I signed on for was not where it needed to be that winter. And yeah, it was a bad day, but I learned. I have no regrets, and I've learned so much from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of the piece is to essentially posit that, you come right out of the gate and you say a group is not safer just because it's a group. So
yeah, I was generating as much risk as part of this trio than had I been alone. And I think that's what I try to talk with people about when I'm giving these talks, is because there are people that are critical about solo hikers. There's a lot of focus on the risks and the irresponsibility of going solo. And what I try to explain is that, again, I was part of a trio here. And had I been by myself, or had I been with my climbing partner, I think the day would have unfolded either not at all. I wouldn't have gone, or it would have been a lot different.
And you're touching on familiarity with your partner, perhaps trust building and things like that. In the essay, you talk about this doctor, Michael Roberto, 3 conditions that can impact a group's behavior and decision making. Do you want to touch upon those factors?
Yeah. So team psychological safety. There's 3 components to it: leader, coaching, and support. There's familiarity and prior interactions. And you've got me on the third. Maybe
I have it right here. Prior interaction, member status.
Status differences. So
right.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I think I very clearly planted myself in the guest category on that hike. And I behaved as if I was a guest, which is, you're there, you're present, but you're not doing anything that's going to cause your hosts to be disappointed. And I've explained, I've learned so much from this that, I look back at, I think I was 40 years old or so when that happened. And I'm reminded of the teenager and the middle school student that I was, and similar behaviors, just not speaking up, not bringing my voice to something, following along, wanting to be liked, wanting to be accepted. And I think those are very human traits, and in all of us. And it just depends on the situation as to how prominent it becomes. Yeah,
and you touch upon, I think you source other writers about this, but you touch upon the fact that for a group to be really successful, you have to have that psychological safety. Is that the term? So the ability to speak up?
Yeah. So I think when those 3 things are present, when the leader of the group, whether it's informal or it's quite obvious and structured, approaches the work of the group as wanting the group to have support and a good experience, and not autocratic, and that team members feel that this leader has, is looking out for their best interest, has their safety and well-being and success in mind. The more that we interact with one another, the more trust is built, the more opportunity there is for candor. And the more we downplay authority, power, tenure, expertise, and only really leverage that when it's absolutely necessary, those status differences within that group are diminished. And really what happens is when you have those 3 components in place, we move to team learning behavior. And the team is open to learning, building experience, expertise, wisdom. They can be candid with one another in a respectful way. And it minimizes risks, but it also, because I come from risk management. I don't come from this place of we shouldn't take risks. I think some degree of risk taking is really critical to our own development.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's necessary.
Yep.
Pushing the boundary a little bit to learn and to see what you're capable of, and then to backtrack or scale back if you have to. Yeah, that's actually one of my questions. So yeah. Yeah,
and I think just to finish my thought, because I will definitely lose it, is that. So on the flip side, it minimizes risk, but it also positions the group to maybe assume more risk than normal, because there's that high level of trust. There's that openness. If something starts to go wrong or somebody feels uncomfortable, somebody in this group, I'm confident, is going to speak up, because we have that cohesion.
I think my takeaway then, listening to this, Ty, is that you're going to have group dynamics no matter what. Like if you have a situation where somebody is more experienced, that's just the reality of what the group dynamics are going to be. But it sounds to me like one of the things you can do is, if you recognize that maybe you're not like in a position of perceived weakness, you want to make sure that all of the group members are clear that, you're not positioning yourself as the leader or above them. And you want to make sure that you're communicating early and often around the fact that, we're all equals, and that, people should be quick to speak up if they're not comfortable with what's going on during the hike.
Yeah. And I think it's also important for the person in a leadership role to project humility, genuine humility. And that might mean taking ownership of, in front of the group, of something that either went wrong in real time or an experience that person had in the past that, again, got away from them, as things just get away from any of us. And I think that helps to build confidence in the leader. And I think it really contributes to that sense of trust we can have with each other. Hey, if this person who's guiding us or we're following had this happen, I appreciate that person sharing it.
Mm-hmm. So here's a hypothetical. So assume you're on this hike and your assumed leader were one of these two individuals, and you felt as though were they rightly there as leader for that particular trip, first off?
It was so informal.
It was. Okay.
Yeah.
I read that one of the people would come back and check on you. You were a bit behind, which is great. What would happen if one of those two individuals broke that assumption of yours and failed or made a bad decision? Or what happens when a leader just walks you right into a bad situation?
Well, I think we see it happen in the mountains, and I think we see it happen in organizations and within social groups. I don't know what would have happened. I don't hold my two hiking companions responsible at all. I take complete ownership for what happened. And here's just a side story to the whole thing that just talks about how small this state is. When I wrote Weaknesses in Numbers, which was well before the book or any thought of writing the book, I changed the names of the people that I went with. And when the book came out, I did a book talk over in Tamworth at the library, and one of the individuals was present there for the book talk and knew by this time, and I hadn't seen, this was 10 years later. This is how conflict in the Granite State works. But this was I hadn't seen this person in 10 years. And here we are, February 2018, 10 years after this happens. And by then he was well aware that it was this experience that he was involved with me. And he said, I had no idea you were in that much trouble. And I could tell he was wearing that concern. And I said, it wasn't your fault. I didn't tell you I was in trouble, and I should have. And I've had some pushback from people over the years as I've shared that story. Well, they should have known, but Stomp, you get up in full conditions. Mm-hmm. It's in some ways, you've got your balaclava on, your goggles are on, your hood's over, you can't hear anything. You're in there is some, you're kind of on your own to a certain degree. We were all getting tossed around that ridge that day. They were getting bullied probably as much as I was. It's just my physical fitness was so pathetic that I think I was so much more taxed, which contributed to my really poor performance that day.
Yeah. How do you think this applies to the hiking buddies, Mike?
Well, I think it's just there's people that organize hikes. So the Hiking Buddies is a meetup group that is on social media, and anybody can basically post a hike and say, I'm going on this hike. And people self-select in based on, okay, I'm a slow hiker, this is going to be a fast pace or whatever. And I think that the people that are, primarily I would say the people that are organizing the hikes need to sort of take some of the advice that Ty's talking about around, like, if you are a leader and you are a perceived strong hiker, just make sure that everybody is aware of the fact that, we're going to stick together as a group. I'm going to check in on people, make sure that they're okay, and be humble about it and be like, look, it's not that I'm questioning your ability, but we've never hiked before. I want everyone to have fun. That's really the goal of the activity, is to have fun and not to be grinding. If you do want to go out and do a 25-mile hike or a crazy Pemi loop, then I guess that's a different dynamic. But for the most part, the goal of being out there is to have fun and to stay safe.
Right. But in terms of how does a leader establish themselves within one of these events? I'm not picking on them in particular, but just these large social media events that are popping up everywhere.
Well, I think one thing, and I hosted a hiking buddy, I think one of the things is avoid large groups. Put a limit on it and say, like, I'm only going to host 4 or 5 people, because when you get in these large groups, that gets a little crazy. But I think I can only tell you how I handled it. And what I said to the 3 people that joined me is I said, look, I'm going to navigate. We went down the Lincoln Slide and we bushwhacked out to Owl's Head. So it wasn't it was a tough hike. And I said to them, look, it's going to be a difficult hike. There's going to be, a lot of loose footing coming down the slide. We're going to be doing some bushwhacking. And I'll lead for the most part until we get to Owl's Head. And I think the dynamic worked out well. We all had the same pace. We kind of stayed together. I was actually probably the weakest physical hiker in that group. So it kind of turned out well, as I knew where I was going, but I didn't have the physical skills of the other hikers. And I just continue to check in on people to say, like, look, if you're not feeling well, we can skip Owl's Head Slide and we'll just go right out. So I think people just need to keep everybody's safety in mind.
Okay, yeah, but so you were the de facto default leader. That's what I'm getting at. It's like, it's just so arbitrary and random. So you're walking into potentially a hornet's nest, I guess, with these trips, right?
Yeah, I think the point I wanted to make is I'm not on social media, so I'm familiar with this, and I'm only familiar with the buddy hikes because a really good friend of mine does that. And I think the good thing that's spun out of that is the initial group that he participated with. Now they go out together all the time. So it's generally the same group. I think the thing I would want to be mindful of if I'm involved in that is I might be perceived as the leader just based on the fact that I posted the hike. And right. So I think you just want to ask yourself that question of there's the potential that I'm going to become the default leader. Mm-hmm. Do I want that? Am I able to take on that role? Because one of the first things that may need to happen at the trailhead at the meetup is to identify who that person should be, or whether it's going to be collective. But it's just something to be mindful of.
Yeah, it's really
perception is really powerful.
Yeah, and as the leader, I got us all lost. Once we exited the drainage, I proceeded to get us lost almost immediately. So, but I was honest and said, like, well, listen, we're going to have to navigate a little bit. I don't really know where we are. So, and nobody panicked. So it worked out okay.
I'm not really feeling the pressure, Stomp, on my ridge traverse. So.
From me?
Yeah, I thought there was going to be more pressure applied for my decisions, but
no. I mean, I think it's probably because I've been there. Mike's been there. We've all been there, and I guess it's one thing to read it; it's another thing to live it, and it's such a subjective experience to some sense. You know what I mean? So yeah, no judgment on my end.
Okay, maybe you know what I mean. Listeners will have questions or comments at the end.
I think you'd have to read it, and
yeah.
Yeah, and Ty, your point about your friend who found his people, I think that's the ultimate goal. Is I like to hike solo. I have no problem doing it, but I also have, I hike with Stomp and a few of our core friends, and then I have another friend of mine, Tom, who I hike with, and we don't hike at the same pace. So there's been a little bit of tension occasionally around the fact that he's a bit slower than I am on hikes, but the reason I like to hike with Tom is that I know with 100% certainty that if one of us is not feeling it or we need to make a critical decision, that we're both going to be on the same page and there's not going to be any judgment. So for me, even though we don't align from a speed perspective all the time, that finding that group that I have absolute trust in is more important to me than aligning our hiking pace together.
So has that tension been acknowledged and discussed, or is it buried under a couple of layers of interpersonal dynamics?
No, it's discussed out in the field, and then we don't really bring it up too much outside of. I think Tom will bring it up and say, like, look, I don't know if you don't want to hike with me because I'm too slow. Let me know. And my perspective is always that I would rather it's more enjoyable for me to hike with him. And on a 3-day through hike, a section hike of the AT is usually when these things pop up. If it's just a day hike, then it doesn't really matter. So, but we have discussed it, and I'll bring it up on the car ride. We're going hiking on Friday, so we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, and Ty, and if you're asking me, like in terms of like my search and rescue mind or something, I think you were prepared, right? I mean, absolutely prepared. But the one thing that comes to my mind is when you started getting leg cramps. Like for me, that is terrifying.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
There were so many times I wanted to turn around. When I woke up that morning. And I took a photograph that day, which it's out there. I think it's and I looked outside and I could hear the wind buffeting the house. At the time I lived about 30 minutes south of there. I didn't want to go. I'm like, I hadn't done the Traverse before in the winter. I'd been on Lafayette in storms before. I was comfortable, but guess who I was with? I was with my normal climbing partner. But I didn't want to go. My ego would not allow me to pick up the phone, to call one of them, to say, today's not the day for me. I mean, one of the reasons you want to get up there is for the views. There were going to be no views that day. So then the next default is, well, get up there for the challenge. And, I got more than what I bargained for. But I can think of numerous times where I knew what the right answer was. And I just couldn't bring myself to disrupt their day out. Again, I had myself in that guest status. I didn't perceive that I had any less experience. It was my own stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's even worse on the ridge too, because if I remember the story correctly, you came up from Old Bridle. So the second you decide to ascend down Lafayette and you get to a point of no return where it's like 6 of one, half dozen of the other, going back or moving forward, and then you've got a whole like mile and a half where you're inside your own head being like, oh, I should have made this decision or that decision, and you've got to live with that for what is it, like 2.5 hours of fun hiking.
And I didn't. I was dehydrated. I wasn't focused on self-care. You descend off Lafayette and you're like, okay, this thing's almost over. I didn't have a grasp of the terrain across the ridge because I hadn't been there, only from what I've seen, but you couldn't see the ridge at all. So I had no perception of where the finish line was. And I can remember starting up Lincoln and saying, oh my gosh, this is not good. When is this going to end? And even when you drop down the other side of Lincoln, there's still these rolling terrain in certain spots that don't seem like a big deal if you're in shape and hydrated. But when you're not, they feel just as steep as everything else you've done that day. So, right. I suffered. I mean, and it was a grind to get out of it. But again, as I said earlier, I don't regret it because it's a frame of reference for me, and we all have those frame of references. I can be in a situation now, whether it's at work or personally, or I go back to that and say, okay, this is tough right now. Is it as tough as what it was like on that ridge? And what did I do to get through that? Because I can get through this. Mm-hmm. And, I think there's some value in suffering. In certain cases, I think it builds resilience and it obviously adds a lot of perspective to your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we'll talk about like the need or the importance of local knowledge and having an idea of what the scale is of the area you're hiking. Because my opinion is it's a lot easier to make those calls to turn around when you've been there, done that, and it's very, very difficult to do it if you haven't. So we'll probably talk about that a little bit when we cover Kate. But Stomp, I think you were going to talk a little bit about how these group concepts might relate to SAR team members and when you're on missions and things like that. Right. Actually, to a larger degree, I wanted to talk or get your take on how group dynamics work between the search and rescue agencies in New Hampshire. Say, okay, you have all the volunteer teams underneath Fish and Game. Every team has a different culture underneath. I can certainly say for PEMI and MRS and everything else. So just wanted to see if you've seen it or experienced any issues with that dynamic, with Fish and Game being at the top, or if there's a time that, for a team to mature and actually step up and actually usurp
the lead position of Fish and Game at times? Or, I mean, how does that work with all these different teams?
Yeah, now, Stomp, you're at the tip of that spear. So if I talk out of school or if I say something that isn't accurate, please call me out on it. My sense is there's a lot of humility within these groups. Any group is going to have some of those dynamics we've already talked about. But mm-hmm. I think there's a recognition between Fish and Game and the volunteer teams that one really can't be successful without the other. Mm-hmm. And that there's gratitude there that Fish and Game knows it's a 17-member roughly team that they can't possibly do this on their own. Yeah. There are situations that come up in the mountains that require a particular area of expertise, whether it's local knowledge of terrain and routes or whether the conditions are just such that you have to, there's a certain amount of technical competency that you have to devote to that particular area or accident. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's I think it's collaborative, it's cooperative. I'm not going to say there aren't tensions and disagreements, but they work through those. Yeah. They have a SAR working group that meets once a month, where representatives from each team and Fish and Game meet and they talk about accidents and incidents and they work through that stuff so that the next time there is one, they've already had that conversation. I also think that, in terms of Fish and Game, Jim Nealand, who I'm sure he's the team leader of that, and he just does such a good job. And mm-hmm. ego doesn't get brought into these things, and I think he just does a really nice job of working with the other teams and deferring on situations and where that extra expertise is needed. So I don't know.
Have you seen any other situations in a different context where there were issues with this type of structure?
Well, it's such a unique structure.
It is,
right? And I think one of the reasons I am so thankful to be able to share these stories is because we should be really proud of search and rescue in New Hampshire. That not only Fish and Game, but the volunteer teams that exist and the fact that they will just stop whatever they are doing to go out and help fellow hikers or even searches that need augmentation in urban or rural areas, not in the mountains. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to compare it to anything else I've seen because it's almost like it doesn't. In some ways, it doesn't exist elsewhere. It's so unique and it's special to see it. And I'm sure for you, I don't want to speak for you, but it's got to be pretty rewarding to be a part of that community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting when and again, I'm not on search and rescue, but Stomp, when you did the breakdown in one of our early episodes, the thing that strikes me about the way that it's structured is that it's really very decentralized, very distributed across the state. And I think the more I see of what needs to happen when a rescue situation starts, it makes sense, is that you can't, we think of law enforcement as sort of these centralized structures where everybody sort of coordinates out of one area and goes out to where the problems are. But the way that it's structured in New Hampshire is that it is decentralized, but it's that way because from a geographic perspective, you need to be able to apply a high volume of people to respond to an incident quickly. And that's really the only way that you can have it set up to be effective, I think. Unless you have a small geography.
Yeah, I don't think the trust and relationships that exist within SAR they certainly weren't built overnight. I think if you talk with Rick Wilcox, who was one of the founders of Mountain Rescue Service, initially, because Fish and Game has had that long-term oversight, it was law enforcement and climbers coming together and groups that you wouldn't necessarily expect to come together. And he said, early on there were issues between the two groups because they can look through different lenses. But all of that's been worked on and a lot of focus and energy is put on it outside of rescue operations. And I think we see the results of that just in the work that they do and how effective these teams are at helping people.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the work group. The work group is fantastic. it's community building, and it just provides so much insight into what the other teams are experiencing and just working out issues. And then, of course, we have the New Hampshire Outdoor Council above all that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing structure here in New Hampshire. Great essay. I think I do have some questions that I'll bring up later during the discussion on Last Traverse in terms of leadership and whatnot. So I think we can move on, Mike, if you want to.
Well, before we move on, Ty, I just want to give you one side story around group dynamics where Stomp did not sort of speak up when he was in a bad situation. And, I thought it would be an interesting little side story. So we covered this story previously, but I met up with Stomp probably about 2-3 years ago on 4th of July weekend, and we were doing a Pemi loop with a third friend of ours who he's a guide for Redline guides. And so the three of us set off to do a Pemi loop from Lincoln Woods. And at the time, Stomp decided he was going to bring his bear spray with him. So he had it in his pocket. And very early on in the hike, the bear spray exploded into his pant leg. And he, I said to him, I was like, that's going to cause a problem. And he was like, no, it's no big deal.
That was
no big
4
deal.
miles in.
So 4 miles in. So we proceed to, I think we got past Bond Cliff, and then we're going up to, we're hiking the misery that is Garfield Ridge Trail up to Garfield. And I look down and I see Stomp, and the bear spray had just bled into his leg, and he didn't say anything to us. So we had to say to him,
I took my hands and rubbed my eyes, so it was on my eyes and my face, and
yeah, and he refused to show any level of weakness. So I finally just sort of had said, let's talk about this. You're hurting bad. And I think ever since then, that kind of broke the ice, where anytime I'm hiking with Stomp, I have no problem just calling him out and saying, are you okay? But
and don't let him bring chemicals on hikes, right?
Yes, exactly.
So what caused you to not bring that forward? As I'm sure it started to impact you.
Honestly, it was subtle at first, but then we were in the bonds and it would start to kick in. It was melding with my sweat and my body chemistry. And then from there, we were committed. And physically, I was still moving. So it actually became this weird event where I was so focused on it that I was just, taken away from the misery of the hike, or the challenge of the hike, in a sense. It was almost this weird paradox, but, yeah. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. But I mean, we could have bailed out. But I didn't even ask you. I was sort of taking the perspective that, that's his problem and he'll be fine. And it wasn't until we kind of stopped for a little while and I took a good look at him. He's not a good looking guy to begin with, but he looked extra ugly that day. And I remember saying to him, do we have to stop, or do we need to put water in?
It's easy to say those things when you're remote, Mike.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sitting here in the room with him, so
yes,
not really fair.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you failed in your leadership duty that day, Mike.
I apologize.
You didn't see the red flag, and you just carried me into my doom. No, he's exaggerating. It actually wasn't that bad, but I don't know.
It was pretty bad. Anyway, Ty, the other thing I will say I appreciate is, as a, calling out in risk management, that you're somebody that, believes that we should be focusing on risk. I deal with some of our risk management and safety people in work. And a lot of times, I always joke to say the position for risk management is that, accept no risk. So it's nice to hear.
Yeah. I understand where that comes from, and but I believe that there's a way to go about assuming risk, and the benefits that can come from that. So I'm not really absolutely no, you can't do this kind of person. I mean, I think it's how do we figure out whether it's feasible and what needs to happen for that to take place.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think we want to transition into talking a little bit about where you'll find me in the story of Kate Matrosova. I think I was talking to Stomp about this a little bit, Ty. You did a deep dive with the Warden's Watch podcast. So my recommendation for anybody that's interested in this story is obviously to read the book, but also to listen to the Warden's Watch podcast for a really detailed summary of it. So I don't think we're going to get into all the nuances of the story, but just at a very high level. Do you want to just sort of give us a breakdown of the story of Kate and a little bit about what occurred that day?
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about the fact that this happened on over February 15th and 16th, 2015, but the story I think starts way before that. And one of the reasons I tell these stories is because, again, I think we can get judgmental, and it's just having a recognition that we all have a much larger story beyond that one incident that can ultimately define us just based on the way people can react to it. But Kate, she came over to the United States when she was around 20 years old on a work-study visa from Omsk, Siberia. And over the course of a decade, maybe just a little more than that, leading up to the accident, she learned the English language, taught herself that, worked part-time to earn money to go to community college, went to community college, was accepted into a 4-year degree program at DePaul, went on to get a master's degree from UCal Berkeley, a really highly competitive graduate cohort in financial engineering, worked for the third largest bank on Wall Street, and over the course of that time really fell in love with mountaineering and had summited some pretty significant peaks throughout the world. Arrived at in the presidential range February 2015 to train, to build some experience and resilience toward completing the 7 Summit Challenge. She had done 4 of the 7, had been guided on each of those expeditions, and I talk a little bit about that in the book. Ultimately, chose to solo hike. Originally didn't want to go solo that day, but could not get anyone to go with her, and elected to go out on this Sunday of President's Day weekend, and felt that she was aware of the weather event, had checked the Higher Summits forecast, knew that it was going to get really cold and windy through the course of the afternoon, felt that she would move fast enough because she was packing for light and fast that she would get across that range quickly and would be able to generate body heat and stay warm and ward off that cold. And that by the time the winds ramped up and visibility dropped, that Kate would be below tree line and ammo ravine. That's not how it played out. Over the course of the morning, the weather ramped up. It really showed its teeth. Kate was out above tree line from 8:50 in the morning when she first broke tree line near Madison Hut to when, we know when she activated her emergency locator beacon at 3:15. So that there was a long time to be out there exposed to that kind of weather, wind chills 30 plus below zero, winds gusting to 70 plus. There was a weather dynamic that had come down from the northeast, those Arctic fronts that drop out of Canada. It's referred to as bombogenesis, and Kate got caught in that and made the right decision to turn around and bail, but that decision, it just came way too late. And so any thought of self-rescue really wasn't realistic, or being rescued, frankly, because of the remoteness of where she was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then that takes you into the story of the search and rescue team members that responded and were activated to try to go and rescue Kate. And the book really covers in a lot of detail some of the challenges, decisions, and heroics of those search and rescue team members, which really, I think, from my perspective, inspired me to really become even more interested in search and rescue and try to learn exactly like what lessons could be learned from this situation and other situations. But I think there is one thing, Ty, I wanted to ask you about is if you ask 9 out of 10 people about this situation, they will say like, oh yeah, this was her first time in the Whites and she didn't know the area. But she had previously hiked in the Whites before this event, correct?
Kate had come up to do reconnaissance on that route the month before over Martin Luther King weekend with her husband, Charlie, knowing that she would be coming back solo a month later. They made it as far as they summited Madison, stayed overnight near Madison tent site. Kate really wanted to go get Adams the next morning. It was about a mile from where they were, as you know. Charlie felt that the weather was starting to turn and also had a difficult go of it the day before going up Madison. They had packed for heavy and slow. He overheated. He was very tired, and he felt that, going up Adams was going to be even more difficult. And Kate acquiesced, and they broke down camp and descended Valley Way, knowing that she would return a month later.
Got it. So she had a little bit of familiarity with the region.
A little. The familiarity really stops at Madison Call.
Got it. Yeah. And then, of course, with no visibility and crazy weather conditions, it becomes even more difficult.
Yeah, it was just brutal conditions. And as you said, I think that book there's as much about the search and rescue operation as there is about the accident and what led up to it.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I think and I would have to refresh my memory, and I think you probably talk about this in the Warden's Watch podcast as well. But I think the search and rescue teams probably went above and beyond as far as acceptable risk in trying to execute those searches. Can you talk a little bit about, like, were there lessons learned from the search and rescue teams, and do you feel like some of those team members came away and said that, like, we really went beyond where we should have to do this rescue event?
Yeah, I think with any operation of that scope, there's always going to be lessons learned, and I think there were some lessons learned. And again, I think a lot of that was debriefed at the working group level. In talking with the rescuers, none of them to a person felt that they were outside of their abilities or their experience level, and that's just in their conversations that they had with me. But I think, if you watch, there's some video footage of it. The conditions were certainly extreme. And I know that, particularly the operation the night before, after the beacon was activated, was incredibly cold. And rescuers had trouble lighting stoves and were running up and down the trails and doing jumping jacks, trying to stay warm. The Mountain Rescue Service team that moved toward the location of the second beacon activation, chest deep snow, post holing, it was just a grueling. And I talked to the wife of one of the rescuers involved in that, and she recalls her husband just coming home and just shivering uncontrollably from that mission because it was just so incredibly cold.
In the beacon situation, I think that's another topic that comes up quite a bit. There was a lot of different locations that were pinged on the beacon. We talked a little bit about the effectiveness of beacons with Colonel Ninnis of the Civil Air Control Patrol when we did an episode there, but I think having a beacon and safety devices is important, especially if you're going to be doing solo activities in risky weather. But were there any changes with the technology or any lessons learned when it comes to the effectiveness of beacons in these situations?
Yeah, I think the beacon that Kate was carrying performed to standard and actually performed better than what those minimum standards are. I think what happened is when Kate put the beacon back into her backpack and left her backpack on the ground, which is that is common hypothermia behavior, to discard gear. That backpack is on the ground. The faceplate of that beacon really needs to be pointed skyward. The antenna needs to be extended skyward. And that didn't happen. Once it got on the ground and is moving around a little bit, that's where all of the signal propagation took place. Also, at the time in 2015, there were low Earth orbit satellites and high Earth orbit satellites. At the time, medium Earth orbit satellites hadn't yet been deployed. And so those are much more prevalent now. And so there's a higher probability that those beacon hits are going to be more reliable than what you would have seen, 7 or 8 years ago.
Do they triangulate between the 3 levels of satellite, or just are you referring strictly to the medium?
It's whatever satellite is passing by and over the horizon or going up overhead is what that beacon is sending a signal to it.
Right. So this medium elevation is better.
And there's more likelihood that satellite is going to stay visible to the beacon longer and more accessible to it.
Interesting. Now we have Inreach, and that's coming up a lot more now. A lot more people hiking with that and the satellite communication. I've always pondered whether or not that is something for the future of search and rescue, actually getting more of these units. And I'm doing some research to see if there are some opportunities there for lower subscription costs, because it really is prohibitive if you think about it. But for some of the missions we've been on recently, Inreach is fantastic.
Yeah, and Ty, we get these, it's like a chicken and the egg question, so there's no definitive answer here, but we get this question all the time around like the prevalence of technology out in the backcountry. Is that giving people a false sense of confidence and pushing more people that shouldn't be pushing it as hard in the backcountry and causing search and rescue events? Or is it an important safety benefit? Do you have a sense of what the balance is there?
I get that question a lot.
I bet.
I had a conversation with a writer a few weeks ago who's doing a piece on cell phones in the backcountry. And he was interviewing me for this. And he said, do you think they should or should not be there? And I told him, I said, I don't think it matters what I think. It's the reality of the situation is they're here. They're an extension of our bodies now. They're going to be out in the backcountry. So knowing that, what do we do with that? What can be done so that becomes an effective tool to mitigate risk and not be really the crutch that is our first line of defense when we start to feel that sense of panic or disorientation or trouble. And what I said to him is that if cell phones were not in the backcountry, and jump all over this if I get this wrong. If there were not cell phones in the backcountry, I believe that the frequency with which teams were responding into the backcountry to try to locate people would be higher, because in talking with Fish and Game, while there isn't, as you said, year over year, the number of call-outs is pretty consistent. What is increasing by a significant percentage is the number of people who are calling 911, particularly after the sun sets, because they're lost, disoriented, they're panicking, they don't know where they are. They get linked up with a Fish and Game officer who sits at his or her kitchen in the middle of the night, flips open the laptop. The cell carrier has pinged that cell phone for a coordinate, and that Fish and Game officer, conservation officer, is walking that hiker or small group back to a trailhead, which prevents the need for teams to go out and search in areas where they may have no idea. So in some ways we can be critical of their existence, that we can be quick to rely on them and not problem solve, that we can go out there without having the requisite experience of map and compass and basic navigation skills because we have this tool with us. I would just ask you to think about what would this look like from a search and rescue perspective if they weren't out there and people weren't able to call, and that incident becomes something much worse, much more costly in terms of human capital to get out there, the risks associated with that, and the fact that the longer people are out there in the backcountry, the higher the likelihood of injury, hypothermia, getting even more lost than they already are.
Yep, you're right.
Okay.
There are a lot of those calls coming in. And surprisingly, the reception is workable enough and they can access the ping and get the location. So it can be a tool in the arsenal. Like we always say, don't make it the only tool.
Right.
Because that's when you get in trouble, whether it be, I'll just turn on my cell phone flashlight. No, you need 2 headlamps, that type of approach. Don't rely on it as your only last piece of gear.
Yeah, and Ty, I think we're probably getting to the end of this episode here, but I did want to ask you, when I think of Kate, I call it the line, and I don't think I ever it took me a long time to get to the point where I have a reasonable level of confidence to say that my line is pretty well defined and I know when to turn around when I'm in a bad situation. And I think that it becomes a lot easier to define your line when you've sort of been there, done that. Especially, I've hiked Franconia Ridge 3 or 4 times. I sort of know what the experience is like. So it's very easy for me to say like, okay, well, I'm not feeling it, or the weather conditions might be a little sketchy. I'm going to turn around. But I think when you have people that they don't know the area, or they're much more driven from an achievement perspective, which I think, Kate strikes me as somebody that was very driven, probably much more so than myself. But how do you get to the point where you know where your line is? Is it just simply a matter of experience, or is there other things that you can think of to get there?
Yeah. So when I talk with groups, I always open with this quote by Goethe, who's an author: "The dangers of life are infinite, and among them is safety." And again, I think getting outside of our comfort zone, taking on risk in a way that allows us to grow and develop and to build skills and confidence is really, really important. You call it a line, I refer to it as the boundary, and we're saying the same thing. There is a point that we reach that exceeds our ability or our experience or expertise to handle. And the further we go beyond that boundary or that line, the less likelihood we have of untangling ourselves from the situation, self-rescuing, or of being rescued. And so when I think of Kate went out there with the best of intentions for all the right reasons to build experience and independence and resilience, but went so far beyond that line, that boundary, that she couldn't save herself and she couldn't be saved. And so I think, how do we find that line? Humility, progression, and mentorship, working with people that have these experiences. As you said, you've been across the ridge 4 or 5 times, and recognizing that, to me, that there is no hack for navigating unpredictable environments. We have to work toward these things, and through progression and all of those things I've already mentioned, that's how we identify where that line is. And then I think the cool part of all of this becomes, how do I get that line further away from me? Because what lies in between that is more experience and more wisdom to gain.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I think that is really, really great. And I think the story of Kate is, as sad as it is, I think that it's made such an incredible impact on the hiking community, and it's brought a lot of awareness to safety and the significant risk that this activity does carry.
Excellent. Okay, Mike and Ty, thank you. We're going to call it a day here on this episode, and we will be back next week for part 2 of our continued conversation. And we're going to be covering Ty's latest book, The Last Traverse, and also talk about an older essay that's actually becoming a new movie. But before we depart, I do want to tell you that Ty has graciously offered to give away 6 autographed copies of his books, 3 Where You'll Find Me, and 3 of The Last Traverse. He's also offered to give one lucky listener a virtual book chat for a group as well. So we thought up a couple simple contests for the listeners, with all the proceeds to benefit the New Hampshire Outdoor Council, the primary nonprofit organization in New Hampshire that supports the volunteer SAR groups. You can participate in one or both of these contests, and here's how they're going to work. For the autographed book raffle, Just make a donation of $100 or more to the New Hampshire Outdoor Council on or before New Year's Eve. Send us an image or screenshot confirming your donation to slasherpodcast@gmail.com. That's SLASR podcast@gmail.com. Include your name. If you want, you can tell us your Instagram or Facebook profile or handle, as they say. And most importantly, that you want to join the book raffle. 6 winning entries will be drawn randomly and will receive a single signed book by Ty. The winners will be announced on the SLASR Facebook and Instagram pages on New Year's Day. Following that announcement, the winners will be contacted in order to provide a suitable mailing address so we can get your prize out to you. Now, for the virtual book chat for your group with Ty, just make a single monetary donation to the New Hampshire Outdoor Council on or before New Year's Eve. Again, send an image or a screenshot to the same email address, slasherpodcast@gmail.com. Give us your name, Instagram profile, or Facebook, and most importantly, tell us that you want to join the raffle. So there's only one winner for this virtual book chat for your group, okay? And that winner will be announced again on the SLASR Facebook and Instagram pages on New Year's Day. And after that, we'll contact you and give you more information. Okay? All right. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to learn more about the topics covered in today's show, please check out the show notes and safety information at slasherpodcast.com. That's SLASR podcast.com. You can also follow the show on Facebook and Instagram. We hope you'll join us next week for another great show. Until then, on behalf of Mike and Stomp, get out there and crush some mega peaks.
Now covered in scratches, blisters, and bug bites, Chris Staff wanted to complete his most challenging day hike ever.
Fish and Game officers say the hiker from Florida activated an emergency beacon yesterday morning. He was hiking along the Appalachian Trail when the weather started to get worse. Officials say the snow was piled up to 3 feet in some spots, and there was a wind chill of -1 degree.
And there's 3 words that describe this race. Do we all know what they are?
Only one hill!
Here's Lieutenant James Neeland, New Hampshire Fish and Game. Lieutenant, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
What are some of the most common mistakes you see people make when they're heading out on the trails to hike here in New Hampshire?
It seems to me the most common is being unprepared, and I think if they just simply visited hikesafe.com and got a list of the 10 essential items and had those in their packs, they probably would have no need to ever call us at all.